Hi, folks. This is Louis Hertham, the original Peter Abernathy. Hell is empty and all the devils are here on the Shat on TV Westworld podcast with Roger, Gene, and Big D.
Hello, friends. This is Gene Lyons from the Westworld podcast, and recently we got some emails coming in regarding what happened to the Telegraph, what happened to the show, where we've been, and what we've been up to. Although we've been releasing a lot of stuff recently, the Telegraph has been neglected since, I guess, the first week of December, and we'd kind of thought that we were going to let it go to bed until the next season came up, season 2 of Westworld. But we've gotten a lot of emails, one in particular from a listener, Nick B., who kind of asked, why aren't we doing the Telegraph anymore, and are we not getting emails, and should we be doing them? And in fact, we are getting a lot of emails from people who are listening for the first time to the podcast, just getting into Westworld now, or people who are rewatching episodes 1 through 9 and 10, just like Evan Rachel Wood suggested you do. So we decided, why not fire it back up again? So I'm here with my co-host, Big D.
Good evening.
And we're going to bring you 10 of the best emails that we've gotten since December 4th, when the show aired its finale. So without further ado, Big D, if you want to roll the Telegraph. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, well, I just want to dovetail into what you said there. I suspect, by everything that I've read online, looking at our comments, looking at the social media, and looking at our download numbers, that this is going to be one of those shows like Breaking Bad that caught on. As popular as it was the first season, and it was record-breaking for HBO for their debut season for a show, we've gotten tons of emails from people saying, I found you after week 9, or I just started the show and found the podcast. I think when this comes back in 18, the show and the podcast hopefully will be at least double what it is now. I'm excited for it. So we appreciate you continuing to write. And I think the audience is still engaged, weeks after the show end. It shows you, I think, how into the material people are. So the future's bright.
Absolutely. And also, people have had a little time to digest, and some really interesting thoughts have come up, as a result of that, where we've really kind of, several people have written in and said they watched the whole thing over again as a binge instead of, week to week, which I still have not done it, all 10 in a row. And so I think that doing that can give you some real perspective on what's going on. I intend to do that over the holiday break, though.
So how about I roll the Telegraph?
Why don't you do that, Big D? All right, our first email comes in from Steve E. Steve E. wrote in a beautiful and lengthy email, but we just cut out the big nugget of it, and it goes like this. One of you claimed Dolores' shot through Ford's head, which shattered the glass from which he was drinking, proved he was human, because surely hosts would have a shield, stronger than a human skull, protecting their cyber circuitry. You're evidently forgotten a scene in the Mariposa about halfway into the season when Maeve shot a host in the back of the head and it blew out his face. It's one of my favorite scenes. Furthermore, Maeve's gun was a small Derringer or some other small caliber short-barreled pistol, presumably less powerful than Dolores' gun. I remember feeling very surprised that a small pistol would do that much damage, presumably expensive to repair. On the other hand, I do think it's likely that that Ford shot by Dolores was human. There are hints that he loved Arnold, that he suffered when Arnold died, that he gave Bernard the Charlie Cornerstone hoping it would awaken Bernard, and he may have chosen to join Arnold in death the same way Arnold had hoped to join Charlie in death when Dolores executed Arnold. Also, Anthony Hopkins earns a lot of money, and HBO might want to reduce the show's budget. And that one comes from, again, Steve E.
Well, that was a good catch, because I didn't remember back to the Mariposa, that scene, until he just mentioned it. I think, we've talked about what do they call it? The shield.
The cordial shield.
The cordial shield. That the cordial shield isn't perfect. You can actually shoot them in the head. But that leads me to a follow-up question. Are we basing our thoughts here also that the workings of their brain and the structure of it, is it meat? Is it similar to ours, or is it some form of a more computer? Is it biological base?
I mean, we didn't really see the blast that came out of Bernard's head when he pulled the trigger, but it definitely seemed when the bullet went through the guy's head at the Mariposa that it definitely seemed like a big meat shower. So I'm going to go with meat. Also, it seems that, again, the show's creators have said that largely they are, biological with some small alterations. So it seems like that would make sense. And also storing that much data. I mean, the reason why the computers in Westworld, their actual servers, can't hold as much data as the host brains can is because I think that the host brains are actually, brains. And so it's a much more efficient way of storing data.
Yeah, and I think also we've seen them when they were working on Maeve, that they're actually laying the skeleton in place, and then they kind of weave the biological material around it. For that thought, I think the brain could easily be a composite material, that there's not something additionally that's on top of the skull. And much like the human skull, I believe the back is much more susceptible to damage. You would put any kind of additional protection in the front, but the back where it meets the spine, I think that's like the vent in the Death Star. You get one shot there, it would be fairly easy to blow out the front. But that was a good catch, and I'll be excited to look back at that again. But I do believe Ford was human. But again, it could be anything because we did see meat, and it looked very much like the Mariposa. Good catch.
Up next, we have Travis M. from Morgantown, West Virginia. And Travis says, I thought the season finale was overall strong. I think my initial viewing was influenced by having watched another boring episode of The Walking Dead before it. After watching the bicameral mind a second time, I have some complaints, while still appreciating some very satisfying elements. As we look back on the season as a whole, let's stick with the Western motif and review the good, the bad, and the ugly, and my top 3 choices for each. So for the good, he says the Maeve storyline. Of all the characters, I think Maeve had the strongest journey and growth from unaware host to sentient being. The timeline is number 2. I felt that we were watching 2 to 3 timelines from the beginning, and I believe this was a great accomplishment on behalf of the creators and writers that expertly weaved the narrative together. It forced us to theorize what was taking place. And the third good point is the show and park atmosphere. From the stunning visuals to the complex park and the musical score, the tone and tenor of Westworld was beautiful and terrifying. The bad, or not so good. 1. The secondary characters. I would argue that Elsie, Stubbs, Teddy, and Teresa were given the potential for great arcs, only to have those snatched away unnecessarily. The second bad point, the maze. I think the maze suffered from a fan base that was rabid in its devotion to the show and intoxicated with theory building. The mystery of the maze was a great element for many of the episodes, however, it lost its power when the reveal was made. And the third bad point is the MIB, the Man in Black. I was somewhat disappointed with the transition of William to the Man in Black. The scene in the finale was good, as MIB stands over Dolores and makes the reveal, but there is so much narrative that was left wide open between the 2 time frames. And here's the ugly, the really terrible, according to Travis. 1. The unnecessary characters, Sizemore, Charlotte, and the board were wastes of space. Their storylines would have been easily assimilated into other existing characters who ultimately had more potential for direct impact on the park and the main characters. 2, among the ugly, the photo and Peter Abernathy. We found out who it is, where it was taken, and how it made it into the park, but how did it change Peter Abernathy? Yes, we know he looked at it and saw something, however his arc was not used to its full potential. And the third ugly point, the gun. Why did Bernard have to be the one that buried the gun for Dolores? It makes no difference in the end who buried it, but it was one of those potential plot points that could have made more sense given the history between Bernard and Dolores. However, therein lies the rub of our problems with the show. We are the Man in Black in all these scenarios. We expected so much from the show and the mysteries, and we cannot fault the creators and writers for all of it. Some things fell flat because we had too much time to create fantastical theories of what would happen, which were never destined to occur. But it's bad when some of your ideas are better than the reality. And that's from Travis in Morgantown, West Virginia.
Well, I got to start off, and always, whenever I'm thinking about flaws in the show or some of the things that I don't think worked as a complete overall arc. Remember, they filmed essentially half the series, realized the direction it was going needed work, stopped and reworked it. So to have a story that's so disjointed, essentially 50%, they had to go back and weave the storylines to meet their new ending. I'm excited for in a few years when there will be a tell-all book that comes out and explains what happened, what went wrong. I mean, we've seen movies recently like World War Z. It was a completely different movie with Matthew Fox as one of the lead characters. The movie comes out, and Matthew Fox is in the movie for 5 seconds. They had to go back and completely work it. So the fact that we have a list here of gripes, that are fairly minor. You know, we're not happy with the board. We're not happy with Sizemore. These were characters that were, and Teresa, these were introduced in the very beginning so that we were forced and stuck with them. That they weaved the story together in such a manner that there was not gigantic holes, that people weren't just screaming and jumping off the roof saying, hey, this didn't work, this didn't match, I think is a testament to the writers. These flaws are minor in the overall scheme of what they had to do. And I think we'll only truly understand that when we get the tell-all, behind the scenes VH1 special.
I agree. And what I like that Travis did is he did mention the good, the bad, and the ugly, in the sense that a lot of times when we react to Westworld, and I'm very guilty of this, we tend to look at it in a binary fashion. It's either we love this or we hated this. And there's a lot of in the middle where it's like, it didn't drive me crazy. Maybe it was meant for someone else. Maybe there's a reason for it later. And then, like you said, maybe it just has to do with production issues. But we have to forgive a bit. We're a bit spoiled in our entertainment where, this is a really good show. And I love that he mentioned also the timeline thing, the weaving of the timelines, is that it wasn't so difficult to understand that you were completely confused as to what was going on. But at the same time, it wasn't so obvious that you were with the screens that said like 30 years before, or something like that. So I appreciate that. I applaud the show for that.
Yeah, and I think his list was detailed, and also we expect almost perfection from HBO on a weekly basis because they're so good at it. So I don't want him to think that I'm Travis, that I'm saying your points aren't valid. They are, but if you want to go back and watch any other show on TV, these issues will be minor when you compare.
Thanks, Travis. Next up, we've got another one from Steve E., who's becoming one of the more prolific writers and has a very good point regarding Dolores and her memories. Steve writes, "Hi again. In several Westworld episodes, Dolores appears to remember seeing or even talking with a host who looks exactly like herself. Conventional wisdom is that there's only been one Dolores. Seeing oneself in a memory is merely a movie maker's visual literary device for the sake of the viewers, and if I had to bet, I'd bet that conventional wisdom is correct in this case. But, if taken literally, those scenes suggest there have been two or more Dolores hosts. This interpretation is consistent with Felix's description of how host memory differs from human memory. A host remembering a past experience relives that experience. Since hosts and humans do not look at themselves from someone else's perspective, unless they're looking in a mirror or having an artificial removable radio-linked eye like Dr. Franklin gave to Jikar in Season 4 of Babylon 5, a host would not see herself when reliving the experience as a memory. Another possibility is that those aren't Dolores' memories. They might be memories copied from another host, or they might not be anyone's memories. They may be mental models Dolores is constructing the same way one can imagine oneself. I don't recall Westworld exploring the limits of hosts' visual imagination. Hosts who have awakened might have good imaginations. When Dolores imagined a narrative in which she is not a damsel in distress, it may or may not have had visual elements. Regards, Steve."
Well, I'm glad he wrote this because this is an exact... I did bring this up early on, and I remember noticing the scene where Dolores is walking into town, and Angela passes by spinning the parasol. It matches exactly the visuals that we see when Dr. Ford is first relaying the origins of the park to Bernard. And I brought it up at the point saying, that's peculiar because the two shots match exactly. For Dolores and Bernard to have the exact visual memory, to me, the perspective said this was either the same viewer of that situation or it was a common shared experience. They wouldn't make that mistake. You would have shot it from a completely different perspective. The fact that we are seeing two visual memories that match up is either a glaring mistake, or Dolores and Bernard, or it's Dr. Ford, because Dr. Ford is actually sharing the story. Bernard wasn't there. So Dr. Ford is either sharing the exact same memory, or it was just a poor production shot.
Yeah, I agree, Big D. I think that there is more to the incident that we're going to see in Season 2. I don't think it's as simple as we saw, and it's not quite that simple, actually, the way it was laid out for us, but I think there is more to it. I would love to see Westworld, as it progresses into future seasons, going back to core events, and each season maybe progressively revealing something more about that origin. That would be really awesome to see, and I think it would give the show a little more depth. Thanks, Steve. Next up, we have Phil from Chester, UK. He's writing about the maze. Phil says, I think the maze allegory is an elegant and fascinating theory of consciousness. It feels like a new event is dropped into narrative loops to force the AI to make a decision, and any decision will fork a new dynamic decision tree. The way they traverse that tree is the maze. I agree with your assertion that all hosts are in the maze insofar as they are all in a basic narrative that gets disrupted by Ford. For example, throwing moral dilemmas into the mix or tweaking with their programming to enable memories. I suppose there are two ways of changing the outcome of a decision. You change the choices, or you change the decision mechanism. Ford has been playing with both these variables with the hosts to help them navigate to the center of the maze. The more a host chooses a tree that points to consciousness, the more tests he presents them with, which results in a few select hosts evolving their decision-making process to better navigate Ford's challenges. Their existence is a continuation of tests, like a maze, until they realize that the only test is whether to take the test or not. Consciousness as an objective property is a myth. Realizing this paradoxically is the most sentient behavior you can display.
Yeah, and I like this. Each of the hosts has a personality, which is not only determined by their narrative, but also their set of traits, what they are set. So each one will independently react to a situation completely differently. And I always revert back to the dialogue tree that we see when Maeve is in with Felix the first time. And Felix is telling her, hey, you essentially are artificial. Everything that you say and think is programmed. And she doesn't believe it. So he pulls out the dialogue tree as she's speaking, and you can see the process of thinking where it hits a conflict. That conflict either goes improvisation or it goes another route until a point where she finally shuts down. When she would reboot, obviously you would hope the system would learn from that, and next time presented with a complex situation, would develop a new method to bypass that obstruction. That is exactly the core of developing and becoming sentient. When you are able in the end to overcome all situations and obstacles, then you are free to make your own choices. Then the tree almost goes away. So I really think this is interesting. And it would say why some of them progress further and faster and some don't. It's a mix of their personality, their traits, the situations, and their coping mechanisms. And I like that. It seems very real.
I'd be interested to see, Phil mentioned, and we have said it before, that we believe that every host is in this maze, right? I'll be interested to see if the show in the future sticks with these core characters and their progression and their development through the maze, or if we see an expansion of the characters that we can see into. Because right now it seems like you've got some background hosts, Rebus and Walter, you don't really see too much into their lives, right? Or Angela or other ones. And it'll be interesting, much like Lost did, where you'll have characters that were primary characters in one season kind of be secondary characters in future seasons. And you see more about, with Lost, it was, the others. The others were just a concept for a while. And then there was glances at them, and then you got names. And then finally, you sometimes even saw the world through the eyes of the others. And it was a very interesting way to do the show.
I think also Lost did a very effective thing. They used the flashbacks as a way to, without giving a single episode to focus on Dolores or Teddy, it allowed them to give a snapshot into the background. You could focus on Hugo. What made him, you did the whole where he worked in the chicken shop, I believe it was, where he hit the lotto. You give background story without dedicating an entire episode to him. I think they could do that without going an entire season with putting Dolores on the back burner.
Thanks, Phil. Next up, we have an email from Teemo talking about Dolores' sentience versus Maeve's sentience. Teemo writes, "Hey guys, first time writing in, but I've been a listener since the beginning. Just have a quick question or proposition in regards to the finale and who is actually the sentient host. The Violent Delights line was listed as a voice command in Wyatt's narrative, shown when Arnold was combining his with Dolores' storyline. Arnold said those words, which prompted Dolores to kill him, and in the finale, Bernard said those same words before Dolores killed Ford. So, I'm thinking, is Dolores still being controlled and hasn't really made her own choice like we all think? A lot of us thought Maeve was the sentient one, but we find out in the finale she was being controlled the entire season with the escape plan. But also in the finale, we see Maeve make a choice to stay and not, quote, infiltrate the mainland, end quote. So, by the end of the season, they lead us to think that Dolores is completely sentient and Maeve was just on a new narrative made by Ford. However, I think it's the opposite. Dolores is the one being controlled, and Maeve has actually made a choice off her loop. What do you guys think? Love your show. Really going to miss these podcasts. It's really become a part of my own loop. That's from Teemo.
I had a prolonged argument with Roger about this. I agree 100% with you. Because I freeze framed the scene where Bernard is showing Maeve that even at that point in cold storage, she was still on a loop, and it gave steps in her entire rebellion. And the last one, exactly like Teemo says, is infiltrate the mainland. To me, that says she was programmed to leave the park and actually infiltrate the mainland. It didn't say escape the island. It says infiltrate. The fact that she saw the child and she chose to break from her narrative that we witnessed, her narrative was programmed to infiltrate the mainland. She chose not to do it. So I do believe she's sentient. Dolores, that's another thing. I had thought that the violent delights that Arnold speaks right before the original incident where he is shot, I don't think that was a verbal cue. I almost got it that was, he was saying it to be prophetic at the end. And I thought that maybe that stuck in her memory, and the memory of those specific words and that instance is what triggered the memory and kind of helped her restart that loop. I didn't think it was a verbal command to say, kill me. I just thought, oh my God, if Arnold had just shut up and let her kill him, maybe none of this ever develops down the road.
I think we're going to see kind of how Ford mentioned that, before Bernard's work got involved, the hosts were, only painted in primary colors. I think that consciousness as well is not just going to be primary colors. There are a lot of subtleties there. And I think that we really need to come up with a new vernacular going into season 2 about what we mean by conscious, what we mean by sentient, what we mean by completing the maze. It's possible that Maeve is aware. She's aware of her surroundings. She's aware of what's going on. She's tapped into the database of Westworld and knows everything. But she hasn't completed the maze, as in she has not heard her own voice internally. It's also possible that we're only being shown Dolores's, path to the maze, and other people have unknowingly, conquered the maze, not even knowing what the maze was. You wouldn't know about the maze until someone told you about it, right? So it's possible that Dolores was coached through the maze, and Maeve just found it on her own without a term for it, So I think that's very, very possible.
Yeah, I think we had no idea until towards the end of the season when Maeve lifts up her floorboards that she had been sketching the technicians. So it's very possible that half the entire park has been having these memories and have their own stash of little mementos, little remnants to help them along. So I think it would be funny if we came back in season 2 and Dolores and Maeve were just the tip of a gigantic iceberg that was kind of sitting under the water unnoticed.
Next one comes from Larry, and Larry did an amazing job tying together The Wolf, Jung, Pinocchio, and Westworld all into one email. It's brilliant. So Larry writes, I've been listening to you guys from the beginning and I've enjoyed all of your podcasts very much. I wanted to write you guys because of things that I've discovered over the past couple of days. So this comes from a presentation of Professor Jordan Peterson gave on the Jungian analysis of Pinocchio. I say that there is a case to be made that Westworld is also in part a Jungian analysis of Pinocchio. And again, we're talking about Carl Jung. So the first point is why it is the god of war. And Professor Peterson says, from the Jungian perspective, a lot of the forces the ancient people considered deities were personified representations of instinctual systems, a way of thinking about the collective unconscious, in many ways Carl Jung's representation of the Freudian id. Mars is the Roman god of war, Venus is the god of love. So now getting back to what Larry has to say, he says, I contend that in Westworld, the Mars archetype is represented as Wyatt. Think of how Dolores and Teddy kill Arnold and the other hosts. Their faces and words tell us that they are aware of themselves doing this, but it is not of their control. They have been programmed with part of Wyatt's behavioral ability. Note how meta Westworld is. Now here's 2 points to support that. 1, Shakespeare called humans the playthings of the gods. And this is going back to Professor Peterson. Why would we conceptualize war and love as gods? Shakespeare, for example, said that humans are the playthings of the gods. Here's one way of thinking about it, and I love this. This is Gene talking. I love this. All right. So the professor says, what's older, you or aggression? The answer to that is the system that mediates biological aggression in mammals is tens of millions of years old. If you think you control it rather than the other way around, then you're deluded about your central nature. And the second point that supports this, is the god of war acts through Dolores and Teddy. This is going back to Professor Peterson. Part of it is that you don't control aggression at all. What happens is you never go anywhere where you need to use it. And so what happens to soldiers when they go into wartime and find they can use it, and out it comes. The consequences of that awareness is so traumatic that they develop PTSD. They observe themselves doing things that are hyper-aggressive that they never would have imagined people like them could have manifested. So I think this is a really brilliant way to look at this, in the sense that the show is being set up with these archetypes, just like gods were. And so it's basically people recognized from ancient times that these things existed, and they existed outside of the self, right? That the human was not in control of love and war. War was in control of, and war and love were in control of humans. And it makes sense. It's not superstition to think that we invented aggression as humans, or that we invented love or passion. That's silly, right? They control us.
Yeah, I think humans this is a flaw that we've had for a long time, that we always envision us at the center of the universe, that we are the in control of many things that we are not. And not that I'm speaking in like a biblical manner, or we seem to forget how close to our primal ancestors we are, and that we are made up of many of the same instinctual actions that control the animals around us today. We're not much different than our primal urges, than our primal, and we see that in not only the host, but also in the guests that are coming in the park. And I think it raises some good questions, and it's some deep philosophical thoughts that I would really hope and think that had come up in the production room.
And one of the things Larry points out is that for Romans, the wolf was a symbol of Mars, the god of war. So Romans often, their fighting heroes were compared with wolves. And in the Roman viewpoint, the god of war is not meant to be negative. It's correlated with, the glorious death of a warrior or an emperor, right? And so in that sense, when we're looking at a world like you mentioned, where guests are coming in to, live their fantasies, thinking they're fully in control of when and where they display their aggression, we're seeing that the hosts can be much more in touch with that. And when you see, as Larry's saying, when you see the wolf, the only people who have seen the wolf in their memories are Dolores, or in their visions, are Dolores and Teddy. And so his belief is that Wyatt is the wolf, and so Wyatt exists in both Dolores and Teddy.
Very deep.
That's some heavy, heavy stuff, Larry. Thank you so much. All right, next up, we've got Daniel from Seattle. And Daniel writes in, he says, "Gents, I love the podcast and thank you, although I'm not sure I'll be as involved with the next season. I may try to just watch and not delve into theories. This was the first show that I didn't just watch, and I am torn. I had a lot of fun thinking about the theories and had fun being right some of the time. However, I can't help but think that I missed out on some of the joy of surprise by going to the internet and listening to you guys. But that's a whole other conversation. I think Westworld is located on another planet, and here's why. In one of the episodes, I think it's Sylvester when speaking with Maeve, he says something like, quote, it's not like running an orbital launch facility, end quote. Now, that is a weird thing to say as an offhand comparison, unless orbital launch facilities are commonplace and therefore an appropriate comparison of something that would be used in everyday speech. Another point, wasn't it another planet in the movie? Another point, could the park be under the dome of some other world where the sky and weather is a projection? And yet another point, the many references on how hard it would be to escape. It seems like if it's just Earth, it would be hard to escape because of the distance, but how much harder would it be if it's another planet? He offers a few other points and wraps it up with, on a separate note, in Greek mythology, Delos was the birthplace of Apollo and Artemis, in other words, the birthplace of the gods. That seems an appropriate name for the place Ford works. Thanks again for the podcast. It's really been fun. Daniel from Seattle.
Okay, so where to start with this? In the movie, the original Westworld was on Earth. The subsequent sequel, which was Future World, was on, it was like a satellite. It was kind of in space. So that one did leave Earth. I hope it's not, and I do not think it is another planet. The comment about, it's not like you're working a orbital launch facility, that's, I think, akin to us today saying, hey, it's not rocket science. It's a more advanced, if you said, hey, it's not rocket science to someone 100 years ago, they might say, oh, they're starmen, they're living on other planets, but it's a way of us expressing that a job is difficult. It's beyond your reach. You're not a rocket scientist. An island would explain how you contain the facility, contain the IP, very much like another planet. I just always go back to the simplest explanation. If I'm in space and we're that far advanced to where we are now, wouldn't they come up with a much more elaborate, engaging adventure than an Old West horse riding? They will have experienced interplanetary adventures. Would somebody really then say, hey, I want to go ride a smelly horse and hang out at the Mariposa as opposed to some other intergalactic experience?
Now, I should point out that Daniel from Seattle is not alone in this theory. There have been several other people who wrote in, notably Nick Rodriguez also wrote into us, another listener who kind of had the same thoughts. What's interesting to me is there have been points made that Westworld, again, is symbolic in the sense that they really wanted to look at an era and a lifestyle that was representative of freedom, kind of as a backlash of what's ever going on in a utopian society that they might live in. In addition, some people have said, based on the Chinese voice on the PA and the amount of interaction with Chinese investors, that this actually might be off of mainland China. And in that case, these are people who want to experience a Western experience. Now, to me, that seems a little odd that the vast majority of the guests in the park are not Chinese. So that would seem a little strange. But again, they're interesting thoughts. I think that people have hypothesized we're going to see the outside world in season 2, and I think it'll answer some questions.
Yeah, I think when we go to season 2, Dr. Ford, and there's been a few other people who have referenced the fact that man had conquered and destroyed, essentially everything that was a threat to them. I wouldn't be surprised if this utopian society was devoid of many of the natural elements that we have today. I get the vibe from people who come in the park. They're as amazed to see a horse and cattle in a field as they are a gunslinger. It tells me that in the natural world, maybe a lot of animals are extinct. Maybe we've devastated the environment to the point where seeing a horse and seeing... why else would you make host snakes? And you're replicating possibly a life form that doesn't exist anymore. That would explain why you don't just have host cowboys working with real cattle. Wouldn't that be easier if you had host cowboys? It's a lot cheaper. So possibly the real world isn't as attractive and as a great utopian space as we believe it is. But please don't give up on the show. View season 1 for what it is. It's a prequel, and they've even said it. They had to take a lot of source material with an entire world and give us a ground base, set up what is our expectation, what's bedrock for the rest of the show. I think season 2, they have the time, the money to sit down and work it out, but don't give up on the show yet.
Thanks so much for your email, Daniel and Nick. Next up, we've got Frank, and Frank is writing to us about season 2. Frank says, the Southwest scenery is too dramatic to forsake and too essential to the show. Although hosts and other characters may venture onto the mainland or real world or other parks, I maintain that the bulk of the storytelling in future seasons will take place in Westworld, although I agree it will no longer function as a theme park. He also says, it seems to me that if the hosts massacred the board and all the human guests in Escalante, humankind could retaliate by simply leveling Westworld with a nuclear or other weapons of mass destruction. But if the hosts captured or imprisoned some of the board inside Westworld, that would discourage humans from destroying the park. With most hosts unable to leave Westworld due to their C6 vertebra, and some humans caught inside, Westworld could serve as the stage where the conflict between humans and hosts plays out. I'm looking forward to future Westworld seasons and your podcasts, Frank.
Yeah, I think it raises the one question. If the information of the events in the park get out, it is a direct threat to mankind. Mankind would have to react swiftly, and it would be usually militarily and destroy the island. I propose that Dr. Ford has planned in some fail-safes that would try to restrict the information from getting out of the park. It's much easier to contain the information, give you time to possibly replicate the board, then put them back out, to hide the event like it never happened. Because we've seen in the past that they've had no problem wiping the entire life existence of a character off of the collective memory of all park employees. So do you think there's a way this goes that they can actually contain it within the park?
Yeah, I don't think it would be difficult really at all. I mean, if you look at, okay, so who's left in charge now? Bernard. Who knows that Bernard is a host? Dolores and Felix, right?
Correct.
That's it.
And Maeve.
Sorry, Maeve. Okay, so Felix is already sympathetic. He's demonstrated. Dolores and Maeve, I mean, they are hosts. So it seems like that would be easy to control. And then as far as, we've noticed that, say the board does come in, right? How long would you imagine people would stay if they came? Now, we know that workers come in shifts of a couple of weeks. So say the board comes in. They could plan to stay for 2-3 weeks, enjoy the park, enjoy the new narrative, whatever. It gives you time to build around it. And we also know that communication in and out of the park is extremely limited. So there are several ways that this could play out where the information would never get out. And I agree that infiltration seems to be the smartest course, much like Blade Runner. Once they're out in the public, it's very hard to find them and track them down and catch them. Whereas if they're all in one place, it's, a war, an all-out, line them up and shoot them down war, the hosts are going to lose that. They're going to lose that.
Yeah, and we agree that it's Ford's intention to let the hosts out. He wants them out of the park. He would not have this massacre, which was planned, go off without actually thinking about the next step. He's thought out meticulously all the steps.
I think it's interesting also, Big D, that we don't actually see every board member get killed. We don't see if there was some sort of a sorting process. We don't see, we see several people shot. But for the most part, you see the host just kind of surrounding the area. If you're going to form a perimeter, I mean, one, it could be to exterminate everything, but two, it could be to capture and retain. And what would be the purpose of that? I think it is yet to be seen.
And I like that Ford came up with an elaborate, believable explanation for Teresa's death, where she fell off the rock. It's not, too far out there to think that maybe all the board members came on a plane. How hard would it be for the plane to go down on the way back to the mainland? Oh, all the board members were killed, in an accident. So there's multiple ways that they can do this without just... but I really hope they don't go all-out war, because I think that's a lot less entertaining than delving into the philosophical, really the problem of questioning, what our values are, what's our perspective on life. And all-out war just becomes another TV show to me.
Thanks so much for your email, Frank. Next up, we have one from Ari. Ari is writing about sentience and hosts. He says, remember that in episode 9, Angela tells Teddy before killing him that maybe he'll be ready to join Wyatt in his next life, which implies that she, and probably other hosts in Wyatt's crew, are aware of the nature of the host's existence. And Wyatt's whole credo, which Wyatt/Dolores whispers to Teddy right before she shoots Ford, is that the host's world belongs to the sentient hosts and not to human guests, which sure does sound like a revolutionary message. Moreover, the hosts in Wyatt's crew don't seem to operate according to the same rules as the normal hosts. They can be repeatedly shot without slowing down, much like how Armistice, after waking up, is able to cut off her own arm and just keep terminating. And there are all of the hosts throughout the park that seem to step out of their pre-programmed narratives and become much more self-aware when they talk to the MIB about the maze. Think of Lawrence's daughter. On the first viewing, we interpreted those responses the same way as the Man in Black did, that those hosts are responding according to a deeper secret programming that is only accessible to advanced gamers like him who are clued into the existence of the maze. But that interpretation doesn't really make sense once we understand what the maze really is, and that it truly isn't meant for the guests. Rather, it seems much more likely that those hosts have already completed the maze and are only pretending to follow the narratives laid out for them. In that vein, think about Lawrence's daughter telling Dolores that they both came from the same place, Escalante, which implies that she, the daughter, not only has memories of her past lives, but actually understands the true nature of those memories. Finally, the Ghost Nation, or other Native American hosts, have an entire religion that is built around the maze and seems to pretty accurately reflect the true nature of the host's existence. The very fact that so many of the hosts seemed clued into the existence and the true nature of the maze seems to imply that hosts have been solving the maze throughout the park's 35-year history. Best, Ari.
Yeah, I love it. It goes back to one of the questions we had earlier. I believe that the maze has been going on for the last 30 years, and I would not be surprised if a majority of the park is already well into becoming aware. And I love that it was Ari, that Ari laid it out in a way. There's no reason for the daughter to actually break from her narrative, which she seems to do on her own. No one commanded. This wasn't coming from narrative that said, okay, you can break free in here. The maze is not for humans, so there's no reason for her to even have an active knowledge to be able to reach back and access that memory within her cerebral cortex or whatever it is. So it has to be something that she is offline. She's doing something that she was not originally programmed to do.
Also, Big D, that makes sense in the sense that we asked, why is there no personality to the delivery? Because if it was something that they were supposed to leak to you, right, they could just leak it in personality. But it makes sense that if a person, it was never written for her, right? So she hears her internal voice and it has no personality because none was created. That would make perfect sense why it would just be flat, monotone. We're probably all wrong, but it adds up. It makes sense. Another thing that's really interesting about that is the idea that it brings to my mind is, so now that Dolores is aware and she's sentient and she's conscious, can she ignore wounds? I mean, if she's shot, can she just go, I don't care. I know that that's not going to kill me. I can keep going.
I think she theoretically can, overwrite any wounds that are not truly destructive to her motor functions, to the way she actually works. We believe now that the 3 pint or the 3 liter limit of blood loss is an internal arbitrary number that says, okay, somebody would die if they lost this much blood. Wyatt's men can just mentally overwrite the shots that are doing physical damage. So I think that Dolores, being aware of who she is, what she is, would make logical sense that she has that ability as well. I don't see why she wouldn't.
Awesome. All right. Last one. We got James from Colorado. And this is James, this is a great one. Hi, guys. Great season of podcasts and a pretty good show. A show that has great potential that is yet to be achieved. I love the finale, most of it anyway, and I'm looking forward with optimism to its future. There has been some sloppy writing for sure, with inconsistencies and bleeding incongruities. I would like to explore some of what didn't work for me and see how you feel about it. I should preface this email with my personal bias. I'm an architect by training, and I see writing, good writing anyway, analogous with good design. Design is a reductive medium where excess is taken away to reveal the simplest and most elegant final product. Also in art, as in sculpting a marble figure, it's simply chipping away what doesn't belong. Writing, too, is about what needn't be there as much as what is there. One of the most quoted concepts in screenwriting is that of Chekhov's gun. You've used it, I'm sure, and it is simply defined as this: a dramatic principle that requires every element in a narrative to be irreplaceable with anything else removed. And as most often stated, if a gun is produced in the first act, it needs to be fired by the third act. In the episode where Teresa is killed, there is a host being built in the background. There were many theories raised about this scene, and I heard on another podcast, yes, I listened to more than yours, but only to reaffirm my opinion that yours is superior. Lisa Joy said the images of the host being built was just to add a creepy ambiance. By the end of this season, there is no mention of who that unfinished host was, and I find that to be too cute. If, as a designer, I placed a staircase that elegantly wound its way through the space and stopped at a wall with no egress because it looks cool, the client would call bullshit and have me fired. That's from James in Colorado.
So, James, I like the fact that you have admitted your infidelity, but that we are your favorite. So that's you're welcome to come home tonight. We're not going to change the locks on the doors. So we love you as well. But as an architect, we'll go back to the issues the show had. James, if I gave you a set of parameters for a building to design me, and I let you go 2 years into the process and start building, and at half completion, I completely changed what the parameters of that building were. Yeah, I imagine you would find it hard to weave the two different sets of requirements into an elegant building without having a few doors that maybe aren't exactly where you want them, where maybe a staircase doesn't end at a wall, but it's not as elegant as you would have wanted. You, in the end, would, I assume, provide me plans for a building that was functional, but not as perfect as it could be. So I wouldn't be surprised in the end that if we find that body that was being built under the cottage actually was an original narrative that was being told on the actual show, but they had to kind of bypass it to join the disjointed pieces of the mixed plot together. I don't think it was there just as ambiance. I think she's just trying to mask some of the changes that were needed to be made.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that was still potentially one of the biggest reveals of the season, and to just leave it out there would be awful. Awful. In fact, I think that if they hadn't written anything for it, they're going to get scrambling in the next year to do it because they're going to see so many people kind of curious about that. But there's no way, I don't think the writers couldn't anticipate us being curious about who was being built there. That's like a birth. It's like somebody's pregnant and you don't want to know, what they're going to have. Like, come on. So, but I do agree, however, that that the Chekhov's gun principle is brilliant. And as a writer and an editor, I know that I'm working with a talent if it's the type of person who doesn't give me anything useless in their narrative or in their story. So I think that's really great. And I love that you brought together the worlds of design and writing and television. It's really good stuff. So with that concludes this week's episode of Shat on TV Westworld. Be sure to follow us on social media and share with a friend. We're on Twitter, Snapchat, and Instagram at Shat on TV. Also, on Facebook, you could just search for Shat on TV podcasts. Our website, as always, is shatontv.com, and our email address is hosts@shatontv.com. We're everywhere fine podcasts can be found, including iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and YouTube. Be sure and subscribe, and if you stop by iTunes, please be sure to leave a 5-star review. That helps the podcast grow. Also, if you're not aware, we'll be doing Taboo on FX pretty soon, and so you can go ahead and subscribe to that. The first podcast is up on that on iTunes. In addition to doing Taboo, we were going to let this rest for a year, as we mentioned at the top of the podcast. But I think, Big D, that with the amount of interest that's still in Westworld, with the interviews that are coming up, and with people still catching up on it and kind of building an audience, that it might make sense to continue doing kind of a regularly scheduled podcast until we pick it back up in 2018.
Yeah, I think if most of our listeners are like I am, because I listen to podcasts as well, knowing when something is going to drop and being able to schedule around it and look forward to it is a nice thing. So I think getting on the schedule of the first Monday of every month will work. There will be some periodic additional bonus ones that I think we release. In January, we have 2 interviews lined up for 2 big members of the cast, which will be exciting after how great the interview with Sylvester went. So everyone get ready on the first of each month for the podcast. And on top of sharing the podcast, also share the show with your friends. I surprisingly still run into friends and acquaintances every day who have not watched it, who've heard about it. Help build the community, get them to watch the show, and then in the end, tell them you got a great podcast for them to listen to.
I think it's a great bit of advice, Big D. Also, if you're wondering what we've been up to, we have not rested at all since Westworld wrapped up. We're still doing Shat the movies as well. Right now, we're in the middle of several Christmas movies that we're doing. But we do 80s and 90s movies, and it's a lot more lighthearted. You get to hear me laugh occasionally, but I'm still usually just pretty grumpy. So on behalf of my co-hosts, Big D and the Raj, I'm Gene Lyons. Be sure to join us every first Monday of the month until Westworld picks up again on Shat on TV Westworld.
Good night.
Good night. Oh, Merry Christmas. Oh, it's going to be after Christmas.
Happy New Year.
It's going to be after the New Year. Welcome to 2017.